The story of slavery did not begin with chains crossing the Atlantic Ocean. It began centuries earlier, through power, war, greed, and the belief that some human beings could own others. Long before European ships arrived on African shores, slavery already existed in parts of the ancient world. In ancient Rome, slaves built cities and served wealthy families. In parts of the Middle East, people captured prisoners during wars and forced them into labor. Even some African kingdoms practiced forms of slavery long before Europeans arrived. But what happened later would become something far larger, far more brutal, and unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Because this time, an entire global system would be built around human suffering, and millions of African lives would be destroyed forever. The story truly began during the Age of Exploration. During the 1400s, European nations started searching for new trade routes and wealth across the oceans. Among the first were the Portuguese. Led by explorers connected to Henry the Navigator, Portuguese ships slowly moved down the coast of West Africa searching for gold, spices, ivory, and trade opportunities. At first, European traders focused mainly on goods. But eventually, human beings became the most profitable product of all. By the mid-1400s, Portuguese traders had already started capturing and buying Africans. Some Africans were kidnapped directly during raids near coastal regions. Others were sold by local rulers and traders involved in regional conflicts and slave systems that already existed inside parts of Africa. Then came the discovery that changed everything. The Americas. When European powers arrived in the Americas after the voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1492, they quickly began building colonies across the New World. Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, the Netherlands, all wanted wealth, and that wealth depended heavily on labor. Massive plantations were created to grow sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other profitable crops. But there was one huge problem: the labor force. At first, Europeans forced many indigenous people in the Americas into brutal labor systems. But disease, warfare, starvation, and harsh treatment killed millions of native inhabitants. Entire civilizations collapsed. European colonizers now faced a terrifying question: who would work the plantations? The answer became Africa. European powers believed African laborers could survive the harsh plantation conditions better than indigenous populations. And because African trading networks already existed, the slave trade expanded rapidly. Soon, the Atlantic slave trade exploded into one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Along the coast of West Africa, forts and trading posts began appearing. European ships arrived carrying weapons, alcohol, cloth, and manufactured goods. In exchange, African captives were loaded onto ships. Some were prisoners of war. Others were victims of kidnappings and raids. Entire villages sometimes disappeared overnight. Families were torn apart without warning. Children separated from parents. Husbands separated from wives. Many captives were marched for days or weeks toward the coast under brutal conditions. Some died before even seeing the ocean. Then came the ships, the beginning of true horror. The Middle Passage, the terrifying journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Inside slave ships, Africans were chained tightly together below deck with barely any space to move. The conditions were horrifying. Darkness, heat, disease, vomit, blood, human waste, and death. Many became sick almost immediately. Food and water were extremely limited. People cried for their families. Some screamed in terror. Others prayed. Many resisted. There were rebellions on some ships. Captives tried to fight back against the crews. Some chose death instead of slavery. There are accounts of Africans jumping into the ocean rather than living in chains. But most never escaped. Historians estimate that millions died during the Middle Passage alone. Their bodies were often thrown directly into the sea. And for those who survived, the nightmare had only just begun. When the ships finally arrived in the Americas, enslaved Africans were treated like property, not people. They were bought and sold in public markets. Families were separated again. Men inspected like animals. Women abused. Children sold away from parents forever. Plantation owners forced enslaved people into exhausting labor under violent conditions. Sugar plantations became especially brutal. Workers spent endless hours cutting sugarcane beneath burning heat. Punishments were severe. Whippings became common. Some enslaved Africans worked themselves to death within only a few years. But despite unimaginable suffering, resistance never stopped. Across plantations, forests, mountains, and colonies, enslaved Africans fought constantly to survive. Some escaped into hidden communities. Others secretly preserved African languages, music, religion, and traditions. Some poisoned slave owners. Some burned plantations. Some organized rebellions. And the fear of revolt haunted slave societies everywhere. Meanwhile, Europe grew richer, massively richer. The slave trade generated enormous wealth for European empires, merchants, plantation owners, and banks. Entire economies became connected to slavery. Ships built in Europe carried goods to Africa. Enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas. Plantation crops were shipped back to Europe for huge profits. This system became known as the triangular trade, and it transformed the modern world. Cities expanded. Empires became stronger. Industries grew. But behind all that wealth was suffering on a scale difficult to imagine. Millions of stolen lives. Millions of broken families. And an entire race of people increasingly dehumanized through racism designed to justify slavery itself. Over time, the idea that Africans were naturally inferior became deeply embedded inside many societies connected to the slave trade. These racist beliefs would continue affecting the world for centuries. But even in darkness, resistance continued growing, and eventually, the world would begin witnessing some of the greatest anti-slavery movements in human history. As the slave trade expanded across the Atlantic Ocean, Africa itself began changing forever. Entire regions became trapped in fear and instability. Powerful kingdoms fought wars partly to capture prisoners who could later be sold to European traders. Weapons brought by Europeans increased violence between rival groups. And the demand for enslaved people kept growing larger every year. Some African leaders resisted the trade. Others participated in it. But over time, the scale became uncontrollable. Villages lived in constant fear of raids. Parents worried their children could disappear at any moment. Communities that had existed for generations suddenly collapsed beneath violence and betrayal. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, plantation economies exploded. Sugar became one of the most profitable industries in the world. European consumers demanded more sugar for tea, coffee, and food, and that demand created even more suffering. On plantations in places like Brazil, the Caribbean, and the American colonies, enslaved Africans worked from sunrise until night beneath brutal conditions. The work was exhausting. Cutting sugarcane destroyed hands and bodies. Heat became unbearable. In some plantations, enslaved workers barely survived a few years before dying from exhaustion, disease, or punishment. And still, ships continued arriving with more captives. To plantation owners, enslaved people became economic tools. Human lives reduced to numbers and profit. But despite the violence, African culture survived. Even in chains, enslaved Africans carried pieces of home with them. Music, language, religion, dance, food, stories, spiritual traditions. These cultural traditions slowly blended together across the Americas, creating entirely new cultures that still exist today. Spiritual songs became symbols of hope. Drumming preserved communication. Secret gatherings allowed enslaved communities to maintain identity despite oppression. And throughout slavery, resistance never stopped. Some enslaved Africans escaped into forests and mountains, forming hidden communities known in some regions as maroon societies. These communities sometimes survived for decades while fighting against colonial forces. Others rebelled openly. One of the most famous rebellions happened in Haiti. At the time, Haiti was known as Saint-Domingue, a French colony built heavily on slave labor. The conditions there were among the harshest in the world. But in 1791, everything exploded. Enslaved Africans launched a massive uprising against French colonial rule. The rebellion became one of the most important revolutions in history. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, former slaves fought powerful European armies for years. France tried to crush the rebellion. So did other foreign powers. But the revolution survived. And in 1804, Haiti became the first independent black republic in the modern world. It also became the only successful large-scale slave revolution in history. The victory terrified slave-owning societies everywhere. Plantation owners feared rebellion spreading across the Americas. Meanwhile, abolition movements slowly began growing in Europe and North America. Some religious groups, writers, activists, and former enslaved people started publicly exposing the horrors of slavery. Books, speeches, newspapers, personal testimonies. The world could no longer pretend ignorance. Former slaves described the brutality in horrifying detail. One famous voice was Olaudah Equiano. After gaining freedom, Equiano wrote about his kidnapping from Africa, the terrifying Middle Passage, and the cruelty of slavery. His writings shocked many readers in Europe. At the same time, industrial changes were transforming economies. Some historians believe slavery became less economically useful in certain regions compared to industrial labor systems emerging during the Industrial Revolution. Pressure against the slave trade continued increasing. Eventually, governments began taking action. In 1807, Britain officially banned the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Soon after, the British Navy started patrolling parts of the Atlantic Ocean attempting to stop illegal slave ships. In 1808, the United States also banned the importation of enslaved Africans. But slavery itself continued, and illegal slave trading still happened for decades. Inside the United States especially, the invention of the cotton gin made cotton production massively profitable. Plantation slavery expanded even further across the American South. Millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants remained trapped in forced labor. Families continued suffering. Children were born into slavery automatically. Human beings still bought and sold publicly. Punishments remained brutal. And the racism created during slavery became deeply rooted inside society. But enslaved people never stopped resisting. Some escaped through secret networks like the Underground Railroad. Others fought back physically. Many risked death simply to learn reading and writing despite laws banning education for enslaved people. And slowly, the pressure against slavery grew impossible to ignore. Tensions over slavery eventually pushed the United States toward one of the bloodiest conflicts in its history, the Civil War. A war that would decide whether slavery would continue or finally begin collapsing completely. But even after slavery officially ended, the suffering did not disappear. Because freedom alone could not erase centuries of violence, racism, stolen labor, and generational trauma. And the effects of slavery would continue shaping the modern world long after the chains themselves were removed. The American Civil War began in 1861. And at the center of the conflict, was slavery. Northern states increasingly opposed the expansion of slavery, while southern plantation economies depended heavily on enslaved labor. The country became divided politically, economically, and morally. Then war exploded. For 4 brutal years, Americans fought Americans. Hundreds of thousands died. Entire cities were destroyed. And enslaved Africans watched carefully, hoping freedom might finally come.
In 1863,
Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territories legally free. And by 1865, the Civil War ended. Slavery in the United States was officially abolished through the 13th Amendment. For millions of formerly enslaved people, freedom finally arrived. But freedom did not mean equality. The end of slavery did not erase racism. In many places, new systems quickly appeared to continue controlling black communities. Segregation laws, violence, discrimination, economic oppression. Former slave-owning societies still wanted power, and many governments failed to protect freed African populations properly. In the American South, black citizens faced terrifying violence from racist groups determined to maintain white supremacy. Laws separated black and white communities. Education became unequal. Voting rights were attacked. Opportunities remained limited for generations. Meanwhile, across the Caribbean and South America, formerly enslaved populations also struggled against poverty, colonial control, and discrimination left behind by centuries of slavery. But despite everything, African descendants continued building new cultures, communities, and movements around the world. Music evolved. Religions blended. Languages changed. Art, resistance, and identity survived. The descendants of enslaved Africans shaped global culture in powerful ways. From jazz and blues, to gospel, to reggae, to literature, sports, politics, and science. The influence spread worldwide. And still, the memory of slavery remained painful, because the damage reached far beyond physical chains. Millions of Africans had been stolen from their homeland. Entire bloodlines disappeared. Kingdoms weakened. Economic systems disrupted. Communities destroyed. Historians still debate exactly how much the slave trade affected Africa's long-term development. But many agree on one thing: the loss was enormous. Some regions lost generations of young people through capture, warfare, and forced migration. And even after slavery officially ended, European colonialism expanded deeper into Africa during the late 1800s. European powers divided African territories among themselves during events like the Berlin Conference. Once again, Africa's future was controlled largely by foreign empires seeking wealth and resources. The scars of slavery and colonialism became deeply connected. Even today, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade still shapes the modern world. Racism did not disappear with abolition. Economic inequality remained. Diaspora communities across the Americas continue tracing connections back to Africa. Many families can never fully recover their lost histories because slavery erased names, languages, and identities. And yet, there is also survival, strength, resistance. Across centuries of suffering, African descendants preserved culture, identity, and humanity despite systems designed to destroy them. Museums, memorials, and historical sites now exist across Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, and the Americas to remember what happened. Former slave forts still stand along parts of the West African coast, places where millions passed through doors of no return before boarding ships into unimaginable uncertainty. For many visitors today, those sites remain deeply emotional reminders of history's darkest moments. And historians continue uncovering new stories every year. Stories of resistance. Stories of survival. Stories of people who refused to surrender their humanity even in chains. Because slavery was never simply about economics. It was about human beings. Real people. Real families. Real suffering. And understanding that history matters deeply today. The story of the slave trade is not just African history. It is world history. It shaped Europe, the Americas, Africa, global economies, modern racism, modern politics, and the world we live in now. Some people still try to ignore or minimize that history. But the truth remains impossible to erase. Millions suffered. Millions resisted. And millions survived. The transatlantic slave trade became one of the largest and most devastating forced migrations in human history. But it also produced generations of survivors whose descendants continue influencing the world in powerful ways. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is remembering what can happen when greed, racism, power, and dehumanization combine together unchecked. Because history is not only about the past. It is also a warning for the future. If you enjoy powerful untold historical documentaries, subscribe now and continue exploring the moments that shaped humanity forever.